Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be back face-to-face in this meeting. I was just remembered that probably the first time that I came here was a few years ago, and I have a lovely memory, so it's just nice to be back with people. I'm Michela Guglieri. I'm a consultant neurologist at the John Walter Muscular Dystrophy Research Center in Newcastle. Clearly from my name and my accent, I'm not originally from Newcastle, but I've moved to the UK 16 years ago, really with a specific interest to develop clinical research and translational research in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I have a specific interest for Duchenne, and over the last few years I gained a lot of experience in terms of managing corticosteroid, being involved in several clinical trials, including the FOR DMD study, that is the study that the result I'm going to present today. When we talk about corticosteroid and about the FOR DMD study, we're talking about corticosteroid in young children with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Therefore, just to make it clear about the topic that I'm aiming to cover with this talk is really thinking about the corticosteroid for the family that have been recently diagnosed with a boy with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So how do we manage corticosteroid as the first approach to treatment? We'll have a different session today in different part of the day about corticosteroid, and there is one later on this morning with Jared Wong when we'll talk a little bit more about the long-term effect of corticosteroid in terms of benefit and side effects. So in this session, I will really focus on the initial, let's say, in the younger boys. These are my disclosure. So what we talk about corticosteroid in young boys with DMD. Before introducing the study result that is the FOR DMD, I really think about why do we prescribe corticosteroid and why have we done that study. So corticosteroid, we can hear about calling them steroid, glucocorticoid. Everybody can use them different names, but all refer to the same group of medication. And the one that we routinely use in Duchenne muscular dystrophy are prednisone or prednisolone and deflazacort. Are what we call a man-made version of a normal hormone that is normally produced by our body. And usually corticosteroids, as you probably know, are used as anti-inflammatory drugs and are routinely prescribed in conditions such as asthma. But the action in terms of action on the anti-inflammatory action of corticosteroid is exactly a reason why we use corticosteroid in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. They also have an impact on immune system, and therefore they usually can be used, for example, during autoimmune diseases or transplant to reduce the response of our body against infection, and then could be one of the complications. But as I mentioned, why do we use corticosteroid in Duchenne muscular dystrophy? We know that Duchenne muscular dystrophy is due to mutation in the dystrophin gene, which lead to the lack of the protein dystrophin in skeletal muscle. When the dystrophin is not expressed in the skeletal muscle, the easy way that I explain that is just it's like an elastic band, and the muscle is not as elastic as it should be. And every time that we contract and relax the muscle underwent a damage. And the first reaction of our muscle is an inflammation. So if we take a muscle biopsy like we see here, even in very young boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy, even at birth, we can see that there is an increased inflammation that here is just described as that little area where there are a lot of dots that are inflammatory cells. And these signs are present very early, but are actually present throughout the disease. When the disease progresses, the muscle is replaced by fatter connective tissues, but there is still part of an increased number of inflammatory cells that persist in the muscle throughout the disease course. Corticosteroids are therefore prescribed in Duchenne muscular dystrophy really to target that inflammation. Although corticosteroid has been used for several years, we know that the major effect is the anti-inflammatory action. There is something more that corticosteroids do, which is not fully understood so far, but is one of the reasons why other anti-inflammatory drugs do not work in Duchenne muscular dystrophy as well as corticosteroid. But corticosteroid has been used for the first time in Duchenne muscular dystrophy in 1974, so very long time ago. And then was really an empirical, let's say, use of corticosteroid as an anti-inflammatory drug in response of the observation on the inflammation in the muscles. And since the first use of corticosteroid, there have been a lot of studies trying to investigate the effect of corticosteroid in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And I think that all these studies have shown that corticosteroids are beneficial in terms of improving or stabilizing muscle strength and function over a certain period of time, but also impact other complications that we see in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, including cardiac and respiratory involvement. Due to this reason, corticosteroids are currently part of the standard of care for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And according to the standard of care that were published for the first time in 2010 and then revised in 2018, corticosteroids should be at least discussed with any family that receive a diagnosis of Duchenne muscular dystrophy for one boy. Should be part of this discussion, and the benefit and side effects should be discussed at that time. According with the standard of care, they should be discussed as soon as possible after the diagnosis, and there are some indication about when should be started. But the standard of care are quite generic in terms of which corticosteroid should be prescribed, in terms of the deflazacort, prednisone, or corticosteroid regimen. But what I wanted to point out is should be part of the care. So, but what do we know about corticosteroid in Duchenne muscular dystrophy so far? So I don't know if any of you is familiar with the Cochrane review. It's just a quite big piece of work when they try to collect all the evidences in terms of standardized, randomized clinical trial that to support a certain intervention. So what do we know about the effect of that intervention in that disease? So in 2016, there has been a Cochrane review of the use of corticosteroid in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And what became clear in that point, at that time there were 12 studies that recruited about 670 patients with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. But all of the studies that have been randomized, so controlled study, were relatively low in short in duration, between 6 and 12 months. The majority compare one corticosteroid against placebo, and only 3 studies could randomize, compare deflazacort and prednisone. So the evidence there are relatively small and are all studies that were conducted a few years ago. But even this study, even over a relatively short period of time, this study showed that corticosteroid had a clear impact on muscle strength and function. And here I just listed some tests that we use in order to measure muscle strength and function. It can be the time to rise from the floor, the time to walk 10 meters or run 10 meters, the ability to climb 4 steps and the time that take to climb 4 steps. But all of these are just measure of muscle strength and function. In terms of safety, the Cochrane review was very difficult to make any conclusion because, as I mentioned, the studies that were available at that time were very short in duration, between 6 and 12 months. And some, for anybody who take corticosteroid, know well that the side effects of corticosteroid might become evident much later on. So based on the study that were available at that time, 6 to 12 months, there were side effects, and this is the list of side effects, but were overall manageable. But the most common side effects that were reported, even in the short term, were excessive weight gain, behavioral abnormalities, Cushingoid appearance, and excessive hair growth. But obviously, when we talk about other side effects, specifically about cataracts or fracture, there were no evidence based on the study included in the Cochrane review due to their duration. What do we know about corticosteroid dose and regimen based on this randomized study is that there is an optimal dose. Apparently, there is an optimal dose of corticosteroid, and is 0.75 milligrams per kilo for prednisone and 0.9 milligrams per kilo for deflazacort. And there was a study that was relatively short in duration, but clearly highlight how lower doses of corticosteroid, down to 0.3 milligrams per kilo, were not associated with a clinical benefit. The clinical benefit was clearly different compared to 0.75 milligrams, but also higher doses to 1.5 milligrams per kilo per day were not associated with a greater benefit. And therefore was decided that the 0.75 milligrams per kilo per day of prednisone or 0.9 for deflazacort was the optimum dose for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. I think that is important here to highlight, not specifically for this talk, but in general, is this study were done in young ambulant boys. So how do we extrapolate in other populations? I think that we need to be careful. As I mentioned, there were no randomized at that time. There were no randomized studies to compare different corticosteroid type and regimen in terms of side effects. some of you, it's becoming probably more and more popular about the high-dose weekend. So it means that they give very high doses, up to 5 milligrams per kilo per day, but only for 2 days a week, it's Saturday and Sunday. And there are a few studies that have been run in the US. All the studies are, however, relatively short in duration. It's a randomized study up to 1 year and some follow-up up to 2 years. But overall, the study evidence that we have so far, and this is a randomized study, showed that the high doses weekend were overall well tolerated, showing a similar effect than daily regimens. They seem to have similar side effects in terms of body weight and behavior, but might have less impact on growth. But again, we are talking about a 12-month study duration. So what was the conclusion in a way from, So what we know about the efficacy of corticosteroid is also based on not only a randomized clinical trial, but also more long-term natural history study that has the disadvantage not to be randomized and therefore are less controllable. In a way, it means that include different populations. Some of them might have started corticosteroid sooner or later. They might have a different phenotype, but are still very informative. And a lot of we know from Duchenne muscular dystrophy in the long term comes from the Synergy study, that is a large natural history study that includes more than 400 boys and adults between the age of 2 and 28. And they've been followed up for several years. It's a multi-center natural history study which has been run over several years. And the standard of care has changed during this period of time, therefore with some limitation, but has been really informative in terms of what we expect on what can we add to the evidence that have been collected to the Cochrane review. And also the Synergy study confirmed in a way the effect of corticosteroid on muscle strength and function. In this case, in this graph, we show how boys who are treated with corticosteroid compared to boys who are not treated with corticosteroid lose the ability to get up from the floor, so to stand from supine, so to get up from the floor or goer's maneuver much later. And the same has an impact on the climb to climb the 4 steps. And these are all indicators to say that the boys that are treated with corticosteroid have an improvement of muscle strength and function initially, has a delay in the decline, and potentially are markers of later loss of ambulation. The study also showed that in the long term, the Deflazacort seems to be associated with a better clinical outcome compared to prednisone, with a delay in the loss of some of the motor milestones. What we know about side effects from the evidence of the Cochrane review of the study that has been run so far, corticosteroids have a long list of very common side effects, which were confirmed even in the Synergy study in terms of frequency. That is the list that are reported from the Synergy natural history study, and in order of frequency. And when we compare, in a way, corticosteroid type and regimen, based on the natural history study that were available so far, we concluded that weight gain was greater with prednisone with the Deflazacort. This was shown in one of the studies from Griggs and Bonifati, but actually a different study was not able to confirm this observation. So there is a little bit of conflicting information because the population that is used in natural history study might be different from one to another. But it was quite consistent to say that the Deflazacort show higher frequency of slow growth and Cushingoid appearance, and was associated with the potential higher risk of fractures. So these were the evidence that were available at that time. But all of these conflicting information, in a way, led to the fact the fact that corticosteroids are beneficial, but are also associated with a lot of side effects. And therefore, different clinicians have tried to use different corticosteroid regimen to try to optimize the benefit and minimize as much as possible the side effects. And that is really the intention about the development of such a widespread cohort of different corticosteroid type and regimens. And I would always like to say that the corticosteroid type regimen that is used and prescribed is based on evidence that that is the best choice for that individual patient. But so far, based on the evidence that were available, quite often that choice was more related to the experience of the clinician that is prescribing or the corticosteroid that are available in that country, and not really an individualized choice. And there were, regardless, over 30 years of use of corticosteroid and the Cochrane review and natural history study, there were still very big questions that needed to be answered. And I think that the question about corticosteroid, probably a bigger one, is exactly why do they work so well compared to other anti-inflammatory drugs. But also in terms of our clinical practices, when should we prescribe corticosteroid? When should we start? And this is a problem for the clinician, but also for the family. How can we better balance side effects and benefit, and optimize the benefit and minimize the side effects in terms of the corticosteroid type and regimen to be used, but also when is the best time to start it. And it's really in this context that the FOR DMD study was developed, and try to clarify this uncertainty and these discrepancies in the use of corticosteroid in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. The FOR DMD study is a multi-center randomized, double-blind, parallel group study, which compared the 3 most commonly prescribed corticosteroid regimens in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And the aim of the study was really to evaluate which regimen is associated with the maximum benefit and with the least side effects. Or, if this is not possible, is to clarify what is the real difference in between the different corticosteroid regimens that were included in the study in terms of side effects or benefit. And the idea was really to allow family and clinician to make an informed decision about which corticosteroid type and regimen to commence, but also to try to make sure that if one regimen is clearly superior to the other, we do not have patients that are undertreated or overtreated. The FOR DMD study, I had a slide and I thought it's quite depressing in a way, because it's a study that was designed several years ago. Was the first, let's say, idea came in 2005. And I'm here in 2022 to present the study results. And why did it take so long? Is that this is an academic study, so did not have a lot of funding behind it. The idea was generated, the protocol was developed, but then was looking for funding. It was funded in 2010, so it took a long time just to develop the study itself and then to secure funding to run the study. The study had the clear message to want to be multi-center and international, to give an idea about how could be the impact of different factors that can influence. And it to be a large study, and therefore when we talk about a clinical trial in Duchenne muscular dystrophy that aimed to recruit, the initial recruitment target was 300 boys, we definitely need quite a large number of sites and countries involved. And setting up a clinical trial in different countries and different sites is quite complex and took a long time. Once we started the study was in 2013, so January 2013, the first boy was recruited in the study. But at that time, the scenery and the situation in Duchenne muscular dystrophy has changed, and were the first clinical trial starting to become more common in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and therefore a study investigating the use of corticosteroid in DMD became less attractive, and recruitment was affected. So to run this study has taken much longer than we initially thought. And obviously, to complete that, when the study was completed and the last patient, the last visit, and we were tidying up the data, we had COVID, and therefore we were not able to monitor the site as much as we could and as quickly as we could. So it's been a long journey. But is this still important? So after 15 years of a FOR DMD history is still important. And I strongly believe that the information that we finally have out of this study are still absolutely relevant. First of all, because corticosteroids are part of the standard of care and are the only treatment that is currently available to every patient with Duchenne muscular dystrophy around the world. And therefore, trying to harmonize the standard of care is important. And then making sure that the patients are informed about the decision that can be involved in the decision around which corticosteroid to take. But also, it becomes also very important in an era of clinical trials. For any of you that is involved in the research, we know that the majority of the clinical trial in Duchenne muscular dystrophy currently require boys to be on a stable dose of corticosteroid for a minimum of 6 months, some of them of 3 months. And therefore, it highlighted the importance of how the standard of care, including corticosteroid, can impact in a way the trajectory of outcome measure. And therefore, it's important to have a population that is all treated in the same way and has an harmonized course in order to predict what could be the drug effect of any new interventional drug. So I think that is still very relevant. And I hope that by the end of the talk you agree with me. So what do we compare? We compare a daily prednisone on dose of 0.75 milligrams per kilo per day, intermittent prednisone, 10 days on and 10 days off on the same daily doses, and the Flazacort administered daily on a dose of 0.9 milligrams per kilo per day. The study was run in 32 sites in 5 countries and enrolled 196 boys. And in order to be included, they needed to be steroid naive, have a genetic confirmed diagnosis of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, have to be steroid naive at the time of enrollment and between the age of 4 and 7. And the age was really decided based on the clinical experience for which corticosteroids are recommended in children within this age range. The study lasted 3 years, and each boy was assessed at screening, baseline, 3 months, 6 months, and every 6 months thereafter, until month 36, when was the end of the study. The end of the study was 36 months, but because it took, as you know, as I mentioned, took 3 years to enroll the 196 boys. Some of the boys have continued to be followed up beyond the 3 years follow-up, and we now have some data up to 5 years. One specific characteristic of the study is that the study was designed according with the standard of care, but have a specific guidance about how to manage adverse event. And this in 2 components. First of all, there was standardized advice regarding physiotherapy, dietary advice, and behavioral management. And therefore, each clinician was encouraged to provide the family with this advice at the time of screening and, in a way, remind them throughout the study, which might have had an impact in terms of the side effects profile that we see. And the other characteristic of the study is that we try to standardize the management of the side effects. So in order to be able to compare the 3 regimens, we needed to make sure that if a boy developed side effects in any of the 3 treatment groups, we're treated in the same way. So we have a standardized protocol regarding how to manage weight gain, slowing of growth, behavioral problem, Cushingoid appearance, and gastrointestinal symptoms. This is just an example for the weight, and there were no evidence at that point how they should manage. So the protocol were really designed in consultation with clinical experts. And for example, for the weight, we give recommendation when the corticosteroid dose should have been increased according to body weight, when the dose should have been kept on the same dose regarding the increase in the body weight, and when should be reduced based on the BMI. So if the weight gain was become a clinical concern, we recommend not to increase the dose and potentially increase the severity of that side effects. And we also standardize the management of other adverse events. For example, in terms of bone, we dictate that every boy has a vitamin D levels checked and recommend a vitamin D supplement according to the national guidance. This is a population that has been enrolled in the FOR DMD study. As I mentioned, 196 boys were recruited and were overall equally distributed in the 3 treatment groups. The baseline characteristics were very similar. The mean age at the time of enrollment was 5.8, between 5.8 and 5.9. In terms of ethnicity, the majority were Caucasian in all cohorts. In terms of weight, height, BMI, and motor performances at baseline, they were equally and similarly distributed in the 3 cohorts, which means that the 3 groups were comparable. The study was, I think, a great success, and I cannot thank enough the patient that stayed with us for all the duration of the study. So the 84% of the boys completed a 36 months trial. The majority up to 78-79% on study medication, when others decided for different reasons to change the study medication and remain in the study. About 50% to 60% of the boys were withdrawn from the study, and the reason of that were mainly related to the willing to participate in a different clinical trial. And obviously, if any boy switch corticosteroid type or regimen, or if any boy who was enrolled in a different clinical trial was removed from the analysis. This is just, I don't want to go into the details, but just to say that we look into the different distribution of the mutation of the boys that were enrolled, and this is because we know that some boys, depending on the mutation, that they might have a more or less severe phenotype, and I think that the cohort was representative of what we usually know for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So the primary outcome was actually have a three component. One component of muscle strength, that was the time to rise from the floor, that was expressed in velocity. One, a measure of respiratory function, that is the forced vital capacity, and one was an expression of the satisfaction with treatment, that was measured as the Treatment Satisfaction Questionnaire for Medication, or CSQM. What we notice is that, so what we observe is that the daily regimens, which means daily prednisone and daily deflazacort, were superior in terms of the effect of muscle strength measured as the time to rise from the floor compared to intermittent prednisone. And this difference was significant. But there were no difference between the two daily regimens at the 3 years time point. The difference in the primary endpoint was really dictated on the effect on the rise from floor velocity, so on the time to rise from the floor and therefore on muscle strength, where there was no significant difference in terms of forced vital capacity and treatment satisfaction questionnaire. Regarding the forced vital capacity, we need to consider that the respiratory involvement in Duchenne muscular dystrophy is unlikely to be shown in this population, in a 4 to 7-year-old that then becomes 7 to 10-year-old at the end of the regimen, so it's not a surprise. But the idea is to continue to monitor these patients for as long as possible, and therefore this information might become useful in the longer term. As part of the study, we also checked several other outcome measures, which included something that you probably are familiar with in clinic, that is the time to walk or run 10 meters, the North Star ambulatory assessment, and the 6 minutes walking test distance. And all of these measures replicate the result that we have with the time to rise from the floor, showing that the daily regimen, prednisone and deflazacort, were superior to the intermittent regimen, with no significant difference between the two daily regimens. We also work in terms of time to disease milestone, but I think that we need to be careful to interpret this data. As I mentioned, is a young population, 4 to 7 at the time to enroll, that were followed up for 3 years. So fortunately, not many boys lose the ability to walk during this period, and not a lot of boys lose the ability to rise from the floor. But the results were relatively consistent, showing a similar effect on the daily regimen and definitely worse outcome in the intermittent regimen. There was a slight difference between deflazacort and prednisone with the loss of ability to rise from the floor, but again, numbers are small, so I think that we need to be careful in interpreting this. Then we look at the different effect of different age. We always thought about, does it starting corticosteroid early is better or not? In this slide, what I wanted to show is that what we notice is that the effect is exactly the same. Whether you start at the age of 4 or age of 7, the daily is superior compared to the intermittent. But what we can see that is if the steroids are started at early ages, so between the age of 4 and 5, the effect of corticosteroid is more prominent compared to if corticosteroids are started later. So indicating that there is a better response when corticosteroids are commenced early, which means that they tend to improve and postpone the time when they decline. This is a very complicated slide, but so I don't want you to look into we look into different factors that could affect how the boy responds to corticosteroid. So we look whether the age when corticosteroid start can affect the trajectory, so how the boy responds. We look into whether obviously daily intermittent, but we also look whether being good at the time of when corticosteroids are commenced, so what we call the baseline value on outcome measure. So if you are stronger when you commence corticosteroid, do you respond better to corticosteroid compared to the boys that are weaker? So we look into different factors that can influence the response to corticosteroid. And what I want here to highlight is that something that in clinical practice probably we were not so aware of, that even when we start corticosteroid late, and this is the light gray, the light gray line, are boys that are above the age of 6. As you know, the motor performances at the beginning are lower compared to other boys. But you can really see that if you start in this population, in these areas, the light green and the black, if you start daily, they still improve. When if you start intermittent, the effect of steroid cannot really reverse that decline curve. Indicated that even in the older boys, in terms of efficacy, the daily regimen might have a major impact. In terms of adverse event, we observed that there were only 3 drug-related serious adverse events. That is in a 3-year-long study with corticosteroid in 200 boys was probably lower numbers compared to what we would expect. One is a potential effect on the kidney function, but was not associated with any kidney abnormality or symptoms, and 2 were reported as vertebral fractures. In terms overall, otherwise, all the adverse events were mild to moderate and were manageable, and the most frequent were abnormal behavior, infection, and gastrointestinal issues. Consider that this could be related to pediatric population or to the use of corticosteroid. In terms of comparing the different steroid type and regimen in terms of side effects, we noted that the Cushingoid appearance, so the Mooney phase, what we call, was common in all groups with no clear difference between the 3 groups. Hypertrichosis, so an excessive hair growth, was more common in the daily regimens, both the Deflazacort and prednisone compared to the intermittent. Skin papillomas means that fungal infections were more frequent in the daily prednisone group, but again, numbers are relatively small here. Cataracts, as already known, was more frequent in the Deflazacort group, but it's important to say that over the first 3 years, at least, of monitor, none of them required surgery or intervention. And then in terms of bone health data are currently, and we managed to have a central analysis of the spinal X-ray that are currently under analysis with Leanne Ward in Canada. And the initial preliminary result seems to suggest that daily regimen are associated with a much higher risk of fractures compared to the intermittent, and we are talking about vertebral fractures, with the possibility that the Deflazacort might have a high risk compared to prednisone, as reported in other studies. In terms of adverse events, the important adverse event, weight and growth, what we observed that the Deflazacort was superior in terms of weight compared to prednisone, either daily intermittent, which means that the boys treated with Deflazacort gain less weight compared to boys treated with prednisone, either daily or intermittent. And there was no significant difference between daily prednisone and intermittent prednisone in terms of weight gain. In terms of height, what we observe is that intermittent prednisone was associated with a less slowing of growth compared to daily regimen, and daily Deflazacort was associated with a greater slowing of growth. We also look about how well are tolerated, because all of these effects can be simply related to the fact that people change the dose because they cannot tolerate it. And I think that overall, over the first 3-year period of time, we have seen a dose reduction, which were more common in the daily prednisone group compared to the Deflazacort or intermittent, but in the majority of the cases were temporary. And in this graph, just indicated that if you can see the daily prednisone is the blue line, they drop a little bit in the dose in the middle, but by the end of the study, everybody was more or less on 80% of the prescribed dose of corticosteroid. And in the majority of the cases, there were no real reduction in corticosteroid, but corticosteroid were not increased according to body weight. And the major reason to not increase the dose of corticosteroid are listed here. Is the Cushingoid appearance, weight gain, behavioral changes, and then all the others. So in conclusion from the FOR DMD, we make the point that the daily prednisone and daily deflazacort are associated with significant better motor functional outcome compared to intermittent prednisone. The 2 daily regimens do not significantly different during the first 3 years of treatment. Daily deflazacort was associated with less weight gain compared to both daily and intermittent prednisone. Slowing of growth was significantly less severe with the intermittent regimen, and the daily deflazacort was associated with the greatest slowing of growth. And those reductions were more frequent in the daily prednisone, but were mainly temporary. I always point out that there are some limitations. So as much as we are pleased with the result of the FOR DMD study, it's been a good effort from everyone to do the best, but there are still limitations. There is no perfect study. And the first limitation is, first of all, we just test a 3 corticosteroid regimen, but as I mentioned at the beginning, there are much a longer list of corticosteroid regimens that are used and prescribed. And therefore, we cannot make any assumption that any intermittent regimen would behave exactly as the one that we have tested in this study. And the other one is that it's a 3-year study. So there is a possibility that the difference between corticosteroid regimen, both in terms of side effects and benefit, might become more evident after the 3 years, and therefore additional data are needed here. I wanted to mention, it's not really the topic of this, but I think that it would have been a little bit strange not to mention it at all in a talk about corticosteroid, is that a question that everybody asks. Corticosteroids are great, but are also very bad. So is there any alternative? And you probably know that have been, over the last few years, there is the vamorolone as a new corticosteroid drug that has been developed in order to try to minimize the side effects while maintaining the efficacy. Vamorolone is still a steroid-like drug, so specifically act on the same anti-inflammatory pathway as corticosteroid, but has a different structure for which seems to be trigger less the side effects. Vamorolone has been studied now in 4 formally clinical trial. 2 open-label studies is the VBP15, 002, and 003, and the long-term extension study. These are 6 and 24 months open-label, so means that all boys were treated with different doses of corticosteroid without a control group. And in 1 randomized double-blind placebo-controlled trial, that is the VBP15 004 study, which compared 2 doses of vamorolone against a placebo and against prednisone. I just very summarize the study results are all published, and it was not the topic of this talk, but overall it seems that vamorolone, the high doses of vamorolone are well tolerated and overall are safe. The high doses of vamorolone, 6 milligrams, seems to have a similar efficacy to prednisone, but this has been investigated only in a 24 weeks, so in a 6 months clinical trial, so longer-term follow-up will be needed. And I'm pleased to report that we are actually collaborating with Revergent and Centera in order to compare the result of the open-label study with vamorolone with the FOR DMD study, because the population is very similar. So are all information that are becoming available. What the study show is that vamorolone, 6 milligrams, seems to have a better profile in terms of bone health and growth, which means that boys treated with vamorolone have shown not the same effect on bone compared to the one that are treated with prednisone. The evidence in the study are only related to biomarkers, so blood tests that indicate how well your bone is. But again, Leanne Ward, that is analyzing the FOR DMD spinal X-ray, is also analyzing the vamorolone data. So are all data that will become available, and there are encouraging preliminary results suggesting a good profile in terms of reducing the risk of vertebral fracture with vamorolone. And also what is clear in all the studies so far is that vamorolone does not seem to have the same effect on slowing the growth of the boys. So the boys with vamorolone continue to grow compared to the one treated with prednisone. But there were no significant difference between vamorolone and prednisone in terms of weight and in terms of adrenal suppression. So, conclusion, what is the best corticosteroid type regimen? For me, the FOR DMD study seems to suggest that support the use of daily corticosteroid regimen versus intermittent as the first initial treatment for boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. What is the best time to initiate a corticosteroid? I think that there were already evidence and the FOR DMD support early treatment before the age of 6 to see the improvement in outcome and the delay in the decline phase. What is the longer-term efficacy and safety of different corticosteroid regimens? So what are we doing for that? So as I mentioned, we will have some data from the FOR DMD study up to 5 years that we are currently analyzing. And then obviously its other cohorts can be informative for that perspective, including the North Star Ambulatory Assessment in the UK and the data from the Synergy. And some of these data have already been published. And again, I will present more in the session later this morning. Do we have an alternative? I think that it's important to keep focus to say, just as I mentioned to the UK population, that vamorolone seems to have show a good safety profile regarding bone and growth. He is currently submitted for approval, but is at this time point is not available, so cannot be prescribed in the UK. So we need to wait, and I think that the timeline is at some point next year, probably sooner in the US compared to Europe and the UK. I struggle to understand the drug approval with the MHRA involvement, so the timelines in the UK are really less clear, but will be some point next year we will have some answer for that. With this, I just want to thank everybody in the FOR DMD studies, specifically Professor Grace and Professor Bushby, where really was the first idea about the study itself, and the study would have not happened without them. The full team of the FOR DMD, but as I mentioned, all the clinicians, physiotherapists, clinical trial coordinator, and more than everybody else, family and boys who stay with us for all the duration of this study. Thank you.
Give up vamorolone and take up corticosteroids.
Okay, do I need to repeat the question or no?
Yeah. So my son was recruited for the vamorolone study 3 years ago. He's almost 7 now. Now we're looking into, clinical trials that are in the horizon. Question regarding the prerequisite is, for most clinical trials, recruitment means you have to be on corticosteroid regimen for 3 or 6 months. Does that mean that if we decide to enroll him in a trial, he'll have to give up vamorolone, which he has access to on a compassionate basis at the moment, and go on to corticosteroids?
So the problem with that is that vamorolone is still considered an investigational drug, so it's not necessarily related to the inclusion criteria. So there are 2 criteria for clinical trial that is problematic. One is that the stable dose of corticosteroid that is required for clinical trial refer to deflazacort or prednisone. And vamorolone is still considered an investigational drug.
Yeah.
And therefore, at this time point, until vamorolone is approved, if approved, vamorolone is not considered one of the corticosteroids that are required for the clinical trial. So yes, he will need to discontinue vamorolone and commence on either deflazacort or prednisone and be an unstable prednisone deflazacort for 3 to 6 months, depending on the clinical trial, before being able to be enrolled. I'm quite pleased and confident to say, because I just discussed recently with Reveragen and Santera, that for the boys who are on compassionate use of vamorolone and discontinue the treatment in order to take part in another clinical trial, as soon as the prescribing clinician is happy with that, Santera and Reveragen will be supported to restart, let's say, vamorolone should the boy not be eligible for the other clinical trial.
That was my follow-up question, so thank you.
Hello. Thanks for that. It's really helpful. Our son is 5.5, and we're at the point of making a decision about starting steroids, and we've been holding out for the hope of vamorolone, really. It sounds from what you're saying that probably we shouldn't keep holding out. I just wanted your view on that, and we'd had some discussion with our clinician about whether he might be able to get it on an open label basis. It doesn't sound like, from what you're saying, that seems very likely. And if he does start one of the other steroids and vamorolone becomes available, would he be able to swap?
I don't have all these questions, all these answers, to be honest. The problem is, so there is, at the moment, for vamorolone is not available. When it will become available through, the full approval might take a while for what I know, but I always encourage to either contact Santer or Virgin directly with this question or ask the clinician, because I have partially this information available. There is a potential consideration to go for an early access program in the UK for vamorolone, but the timeline for that are very difficult for me to confirm at this point. And until we have something concrete to say, yes, that is exactly what is happening and the process has started, it's very difficult to promise anything. Yeah. And I understand that that could be a difficult decision. I think that if the drug, let's say if vamorolone is approved, so the indication will depend on the license, so whether it will be approved only for boys who have never been treated with corticosteroids, similar to the one that has been treated in the trial, so 4 to 7-year-old steroid naive, or whether the label will be broader in terms of ensuring that even boys who have been treated with corticosteroid and are outside these inclusion criteria will be included. I can confirm that the application from the companies for a broader label, so they are aiming to have a broader label and not just for the 4 to 7-year-old. From a clinical, but that is my personal opinion, I do not see why they should only approve for the population in the clinical trial if the drug is approved. But all of this is very uncertain, so it has to still go through the process. So it's a question about, will vamorolone be approved, for which population and when? And these are answers that are just taking shape now, but I don't have a black and white. In general, I would say that if a drug is approved, I do not see why they should they preclude people who are already on corticosteroids to switch to vamorolone.
Thank you.
1 and 2.
Oh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hi, Michela. First, I've got 2 questions. First one's linked to an apology, but it came in late, sorry, so you may have already answered this, but you talk about 3 control groups, and you talk about the daily pred and the daily deflazacort, and then the intermittent pred. Why didn't you choose intermittent deflazacort as well? So you may have answered that, so apologies for that. But my second question is, what steps are being taken to educate clinicians about this? Because we've been in the Duchenne world for 18 months now, and my son is on daily deflazacort, as you know. And we had to really push for that. My clinician didn't want to start steroids until very, very later on, and she wanted to put him on pred. And it was just through educating myself through these webinars and through these studies that I wanted to push for deflazacort. So, and I still speak to mums now who are having the same sort of discussions with the clinicians, and we're told quite often, speak to your clinician about this, but sometimes I feel that there is a conflict between what we're hearing in science and what we're hearing in the medical profession.
Yeah, so to answer the first question, so the reason why we choose these 3 corticosteroids was the most commonly prescribed. So there were 26, and you cannot test 26 regimen in a clinical trial. You need 2 big numbers. So we chose the 3 that were the most commonly prescribed at that time. I have to say that we review, there are not so many data after that time. It means we are talking about between 2005 and 2009, 2010. So it was quite a long time ago. But actually, and there are not so many publications after that period to describe how corticosteroids are used. But there is one study after 2010, and it seems that these are still the most frequently prescribed. there was a small study years ago comparing a daily versus alternate days, so 1 day on, 1 day off, so of prednisone, showing that the alternate was less efficacious compared to the daily, and therefore that was excluded between that discussion. The high doses weekend was not at all in use at that time, so that is one of the reasons why it was not included. So we needed to choose, and we chose the most frequent one. But that was also the one that are more with a rationale behind, to say you give a break or a pause in the steroid. So I think that could reflect. The only one that would be interesting to look at is the high dose weekend, and hopefully there are emerging data from that component as well. In terms of education clinician, I fully agree, is an important point. We are always talking about people who probably are in an elite cohort, but there are a lot of clinicians that are not so familiar. And corticosteroid is always something that scares clinicians a bit, who are not familiar with them, because they have a lot of side effects. And then unless you have a full picture about, say, yes, but if I do not treat with corticosteroid, what do I expect? Might be a difficult call. So, first of all, one of the hopefully the things that happened, that the data of the FOR DMD study have been published in a scientific journal, and have been presented in several conferences over the last year, between both either as a poster or as a oral presentation at the annual Academy of Neurologists, the European Pediatric Neurology Society. So hopefully the word has started spreading, and I will present it also of the British Pediatric Neurology Society. The other things that will be part of the next talk is the DMD Care UK project. That is a project that we are we have established in collaboration with Duchenne UK, so with the very big involvement of the patient community, in order to try to harmonize the standard of care in the UK, but also, and the part of the harmonization is to reach consensus of what we are supposed to do, but also is about how do we educate, and we educate different stakeholders, and I think that for that perspective is the patient, but is definitely also the clinical community. And as part of the Duchenne Care UK project, we also have a specific working group on corticosteroid. So hopefully in the next year it will become more and more clear.
Thank you.
There was one here.
Thank you. It was just a question around the results for the FOR DMD study. I noticed there wasn't a minimal clinical important difference for the North Star results. Was there a reason for that? And if you weren't able to identify an MCID for that, what is, in your opinion, a good MCID? Because I noticed that the overall North Star was 22. Do you have a personal opinion?
Yeah, the point that there are no data on what we're thinking about is the minimal clinical significant difference. So to say that you see a difference in a scale, and you say what is how much, there is a variability. So if I test a boy in a 10 minutes run every day, there is a variability. When this difference is significant, means something. And there are different statistical ways to calculate so there is obviously the patient involvement, but it's not something to say, for me, this is significant. These are statistical calculation. I think that is not necessarily an easy question to say, is a 3 points, 1 point, and is my opinion about it. It has to be standardized, because it might also be different depending on different ages and which item. So there are different ways to calculate that, to say, is really the total score the real value that will give us the minimal clinical significant difference, or it's actually the change in function. So the fact that the boy is able to perform a task and is now not able to perform the task. And so the North Star is assessed as I'm unable with some adaptation, or I'm unable with no adaptation. And maybe is the linear score or the change in function that will give the clinically significant difference.
Sorry if you mentioned it and I missed it, but the femoral one, you said that it was studied in bone health and growth. behavioral? Oh, sorry. Anything to do? So I was just talking about the vamorolone study. You mentioned they're looking at bone health and growth. Any sort of behavioral side effects?
Yes, so just to, I didn't mention actually, but both for the vamorolone, actually for the 4 DMD, we also look into the behavior and we use some standardized scale, particularly we use the PARS-3 scale. Is a very difficult side effects to monitor. So preliminary, I mean, an observation say that the vamorolone in the 6 months study, so in the double-blind, in the placebo-controlled study that compared prednisone, placebo, and vamorolone, they saw that at 6 months there were less adverse events related to behavior reported in the vamorolone group compared to the prednisone group. And there is this interpretation that therefore vamorolone might be associated with less behavioral problem compared to prednisone. I think that we need to be very careful. You know, these are 6 months, so it's a very slow, short period of time. The behavior of Duchenne has different components, and these, you need to really make sure that what you are measuring is the effect of the intervention of behavior and not the pre-existing behavior, which can be fine. So you can decide, okay, there are behavior problems before and then worsen since on treatment, or there were no behavior problem first and then worsen on treatment. But we are talking about 4-year-olds. So the assessment of that behavior might be difficult. And that is why when we use, in the 4 DMD, we use 3 different scales. We use the PARS-3, we use the Rutter modified scales, but it's very, very difficult to see a clear difference.
Thank you. I think, yeah, we've just got 5 minutes to break. I think that's a good time to actually stop for break. Oh, so sorry. Did you? No, it's all right. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't see some hands.
Thanks, Michela. I really enjoyed that talk. It was very informative. I kind of wanted to ask you about a piece that I read about the children as they entered 4 DMD, that actually all of them had not met their height goals and were below the 25th percentile. First, did I interpret that correctly? And second, are there any plans to actually study that further if it is correct?
So yes, and just to let you know, the baseline data for the 4 DMD study has been published or are available. I apologize that I didn't present them today, but yes, you're right. So when we look into the growth factors prior starting corticosteroids, so a baseline, so our boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy age 4 to 7, not previously treated with corticosteroid, and we look into height and weight, and what we notice is that the majority of the boys actually are definitely below the 50 centiles in terms of height, when the weight actually is quite equally distributed, suggesting that boys with Duchenne muscular dystrophy are, in a way, small, even before starting corticosteroid. And the fact that we see on slowing of growth in Duchenne is related to, so what we need to see is not necessarily the centiles, because when they start, they are already small, but it's how the boy deviates from the natural curve. But there is an impact potentially on Duchenne muscular dystrophy itself, and the fact that the muscle is not as healthy from very early stage impacting growth, and that could be justify why they are smaller, but why also there are boys that are not treated with corticosteroid for which their bone is not as healthy as an active 4 or 5, 6-year-old.
I think I just want to have one more question. Gary, do you want me to?
Thank you so much. Thanks, Michela, for that really useful update. I had one question and one observation. My first question is, given that the 4 DMD study suggests that daily dosing is the best regime, how can we persuade clinicians in every site in the UK to recommend that when parents first start steroids? Because I speak to a number of families and they're often put onto the intermittent regime when they start. And secondly, just a point of information to the mother who asked about waiting for vamorolone to be approved. Michela, I think your answer was absolutely right. And we funded the phase 1 study of that trial, and we're working with the company to help their regulatory plans, as Michela is. But it's not just when they get approved. It's that they then have to go through a process of being approved by NICE, which could take anywhere up to 3 to 5 years. So I think holding out for a drug and waiting for it to be approved and actually being able to access it is really a risky position to be in. So I just wanted to flag that.
Yeah, now regarding, as I mentioned before, so regarding how can we make sure that this information is spread. I mentioned before there has been a lot of presentation of the FOR DMD study, and as you know, in a way, there is a project that is the DMD Care UK project that we are doing together with Duchenne UK, and it will really focus on make sure that the information are spread to the community, and I think on, again, on different stakeholders, the patient and the clinician. And it's really to give clinician with the information and with the confidence in what they can and they need to do, but also empower patient to say that is what they need to do. And part of the project, what will be my next presentation, is also to provide online references and resources for both clinician and patients.